Good afternoon. My name's Peter Elson. I'm co-director of the Phil Lab project, and I'm speaking to you today from the unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples, specifically the Songhees Nation, who continue to care for their homeland and their waterways. Lekwungen actually means place to smoke herring, and thus grounds their interconnectedness and kinship relations to fish, water, land, and each other. Note how most colonial names disconnect people from place and immortalize exploiters and explorers. No wonder we struggle to live our connection with Mother Earth. While this has been designated as Earth Day, is there a day that isn't Earth Day? Trying to summarize 4 days of conference content in a few minutes, it's a bit like trying to stuff a lifetime of belongings into a backpack. So I won't. What I will do is highlight some themes that I've heard and invite you to do the same. If there's anything you're struggling to remember, you need go no further than the brilliant infographics created after each session by Annalie Cornelston. They're all posted on each session's webpage. There's a whole lot of listening that's gone on this week. Thank you for listening so carefully to what the presenters had to say. We need to listen. We need to listen a lot more than we need to talk. We need to hear Black and Indigenous voices. We need to hear their stories, see their faces, and feel their frustration and vulnerability, as well as their strengths and resilience. And we did. We also need to hear the silence when those voices are not there to be heard. We need to feel this discomfort. We need to think about the space we take up and who gets crowded out of that space and why. Head, heart, and hands was explicitly highlighted yesterday by the circle, but many others reflected the same thing in word and deed. A desire to, quote, bring my whole self into the circle could have been the refrain of many presenters. Yet, and this is a significant yet, we were privileged to hear how bringing your whole self into a colonial-laden space can be fraught with danger. Real physical, emotional, psychological, and spiritual dangers lurk behind invitations to engage in the philanthropic space. We're being called, I believe, to ask ourselves this question: how do I know that the space I am responsible for is safe for others? All of the organizers for each session worked very hard to provide a safe space for presenters to speak their truth. We heard this in every session, whether the topic focused on the pandemic, food, fish, labor, reconciliation, or grant making. Thank you. Finally, there was a lot of flattening going on. Flattening and decolonization of hierarchy, flattening of decision-making, and flattening of relationships manifesting in such initiatives as participatory grant making. The importance of building, sustaining, trusting, and transformational and interconnected relationships was highlighted time and time again. So we're being called, I believe, to recognize reimagining philanthropy as, in sessions, reimagining relationship.
So we are back on the panel. This is the second time of the closing session. I have the pleasure to do the animation of the panel. On the panel, we have l'honorable sénatrice Ratna Umidvar, Chris Archie from the Circle on Philanthropy and Aboriginal Peoples in Canada, Jean-Marc Chouinard, président-directeur sortant de la Fondation Lucie-André Chagnon, et Sylvie Trottier de la famille Trottier, de la Fondation de la famille Trottier. Merci d'être là donc, à ce panel de clôture, si on veut, de cette longue conférence. So, I am pleased to do the animation. The animation will be around 3 questions that I will be asking the panelists, and they will be invited to answer those questions. But first of all, we need to do some presentation. So I will present myself and ask the panelists to do a small presentation of themselves, but also to introduce in a way their relationships to philanthropy. How do they see philanthropy and maybe how to reimagine philanthropy? So if I present myself, Jean-Marc Fontaine from University of Quebec in Montreal. I was born in France a long time ago, almost 70 years ago. And I arrived in Canada in 1964 in Quebec that was very changing, very in a big transformation. It was very interesting. I live on Montreal, and I am on the territory that is related to the Nation Canadienne TK, and it's a territory that is not cede, and we are now in the process of doing research with Peter around philanthropy. And how do I see philanthropy? I think maybe 10 years ago, there was not so many researchers that were doing research on that topic. With Peter, we decided to maybe bring some new hair, new fresh elements in the university context to be able to have a look at what is philanthropy and maybe to change elements on the perception that we have from the philanthropic sector, but also to be able to bring some knowledge in the training session to students to be able to have a better view and also to be able to work in the sector. So I did a small presentation. I will ask all the panelists to do the same. I will start with the protocol with the sénatrice, and then I'll go in alphabetic order. So I'm giving the parole to l'honorable sénatrice Ratna Omifvar.
Thank you so much. It's my privilege and honor to join you today from Toronto. So the quick short story of me is that I'm a senator in the Parliament of Canada, and as such I'm a legislator, but I was born in India. I won't tell you when because that gives away my age, and I'd like to think I'm still very young at heart. And I met my partner of 48 years in university in Munich, where I was studying, and we traveled to live in his country of birth, which was Iran. And from that story comes the escape from Iran during the revolution and the breakdown of society in Iran. And I was incredibly fortunate to find entry into Canada, and I have been a Canadian for now longer than I have been an Indian or an Iranian. As a senator, I'm a legislator, that's what we do. We make laws, we amend laws, we change laws, we refuse laws, we debate laws. And I'm wanting to use my time in the Senate to focus on the philanthropic and charitable sector because it is such an important slice of our life. It does not get the attention or the respect in Parliament. And it's kind of my mission to change that and to shine the light on it. How do I see philanthropy? I have worked in philanthropy for many years, and it used to be a mantra at that time that philanthropy is a force for good. And I think it is now time for philanthropy to be a force for justice and to shift its attention from being about generosity and about the donor to being about the people and the systems that keep people down. So, in a nutshell, I hope that suffices, Jean-Marc.
Yes, it's a very good introduction. Thank you very much. So, I will ask now Chris Archie to do our introduction.
Wait, everyone. Chris Archie Rensquest, Sequatman de Galmuch from Teskin. My name is Chris Archie, and I'm Sequatman de Galmuch from a community called Teskin in the central interior of what's known as British Columbia, but that we call Sequatman Uluch. My father's a fourth-generation settler Canadian whose family benefited from stolen land as they farmed and ranched in southern Saskatchewan in an effort to help settle the West. And I currently live in Kakite territory, which is overlapping territory of many nations close to the Stalo River, which flows behind me here in what's known as New Westminster, but is also the western boundary marker of Sukhumvit in central British Columbia. So it feels a little bit like home. being here and knowing that waters flowed through my territory and now behind my back here. My work is as the CEO with the Circle on Philanthropy, which is a national member-based organization with the predominant goal to see more settler philanthropic wealth transferred to the hands, to the decision-making power and authority of Indigenous organizations, nations, grassroots movements, and charitable organizations. And our work is fundamentally built on the analysis that settler philanthropic wealth was built on the lands and backs of Indigenous peoples. And it only seems right, to Ratna's point, that we look at how philanthropy can move toward justice. And reparative justice is one of the ways that we can have that conversation. My first relationship to thinking uniquely about philanthropy would actually be when I was a little girl learning how to clean salmon and coming to understand all of the people involved in the fishing, of the transporting, of the cleaning, and learning about how every piece of that salmon is going to be used, whether it was in the garden, going back down to the river, to feed family members, to be jarred, etc. In many ways, that practice of the ethical stewardship of our resource and then the redistribution of the wealth of the salmon is something that has stayed with me for many years. And I am very privileged to have that unbroken connection to my territories and to my teachings about how we are generous and that we also have a broader, more encompassing view of wealth and how we share it. I'm really delighted to be here today. Thank you for the invitation.
Big wish, Chris. Maintenant, la parole à Jean-Marc Chouinard.
Oui, bonjour. Hello, everyone. I'm really happy, pleased to be with all of you today. Thanks to the organizers. Really grateful to share this space today. I'll do this in English today, but I already apologize for maybe some lack of nuance, maybe sometimes in the type of words or searching for some words to express myself the most properly. But before starting, I would like to acknowledge, I'm in Montreal today. I would like to acknowledge that I'm actually in Indigenous territory, which has never been ceded. I acknowledge the nation Kaneagea, Gardienne, steward of the lands and waters which I'm expressing myself today. As you know, Tio Tiage, Montreal was historically a meeting point for numerous First Nations, and today First Nations are sharing this space with lots of other people who lives in that area. Then I'm really glad to then talk from here today. Well, I came to the field of philanthropy 21 years ago already. And in short, my common thread in my journey was interest around mediating, creating spaces for public citizen participation in projects development and public policy. And when I came into, I did this in all sorts of settings, as a civil servant, in consulting services and so on. And when I came into the field, actually was by a sort of a coup de foudre for the vision and the energy of the new foundation, Chagnon, at that time, who was promoting a vision around prevention, understood as interested in the root causes of poverty, of inequalities. And of course, as you can understand, right at the start, how to create conditions that will enable, in our case, all young people, all human in Quebec or elsewhere, to develop their full potential in the really social justice vision was really what moved us and moved myself to join the foundation at that time. And like a lot of others who joined the field, I didn't know much about it before starting. Then I'm entering that conversation as also, like Jean-Marc said, recently exiting president, but also as a learner who learned by doing. and learn also because we open up at one point a reflexive approach and space with academics and numerous organizations to assess our own journey as a foundation. Then, like Ratna said, in some ways, at the question, how do we see reimagining philanthropy? I guess the question is also how to what's the value of philanthropy? Also, what the value philanthropy can bring to the table to reimagine collective future. And in that perspective, we at the start agree on justice, but I would probably put a few other points on this. I think it's also not about us. It's not about philanthropy. It's about what's going on the field. It's we have, I think, as philanthropy, have to move from transaction to relationship, from relationship to real collaboration for transformation. I think also we have to bring more meaning, more strong values that guide action and decision than programs and criteria. I really think that less control brings more impact, and words also needs execution. I would stop there now. Thank you.
Merci Jean-Marc. Donc, ce serait le tour de Sylvie de se présenter. Sylvie.
Merci Jean-Marc. Thank you for the invitation. I'm also calling in from Jojage, so so-called Montreal. I won't restate the unceded territory, but I definitely acknowledge that. I appreciate speaking from these lands. In terms of kind of the perspective that I bring to philanthropy, I think I wear a few different hats that I thought I would kind of mention that I think are pertinent to this conversation or have helped shape how I think about philanthropy. The first, probably most obvious, is that I'm on the board of the Trotse Family Foundation, which is a private family foundation. You work in a bunch of sectors: health, science, education, climate change. And I was heavily involved as a board member on the work we did with COVID as part of a consortium, COVID Quebec, in the past couple of years. And I'm also on the coordination committee for a group called the Collectif des Fondations Québécoises contre les Inégalités, that a group of foundations working on inequality that includes the Changement Foundation. But I think what's potentially also interesting is, the reason that I'm on the board of this family foundation is that I am a part of this family, and I'm thus in a very, very privileged position through the pure happenstance of birth of being part of the 1%. And that's something that is a responsibility that I have grappled with and I have come to take extremely seriously in sort of how to balance that privilege that I have with the kind of role that I can take and the values that are important to me and how to align those two together. And sort of that reflection over a number of years led me to leave my previous career, which was in the environmental sector, to really focus on philanthropy and as well as some other initiatives and kind of roles with advocacy. So one of those roles that I do individually is being a member of a group called Resource Movement, which is a community of young people with privilege that really work to redistribute land, resources, and power. And in that capacity, and as well in collaboration with a few international groups, including a group called Patriotic Millionaires and Millionaires for Humanity, is advocating for tax justice. So essentially asking for people like myself to be taxed more fairly in response to the growing inequality in our society. And sort of also in kind of that individual capacity, I'm part of an initiative that is looking to redistribute financial resources to kind of groups, individuals, families, really in an approach that's rooted in justice and equity and a decolonial approach, really an optic of redistribution. So those are just kind of some of the elements that have helped shape my thinking about the role of philanthropy that I hope to be able to share in the rest of this conference. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Sylvie. So I will ask the first of the three questions that we have prepared. The first one is, if you had the opportunity to reimagine philanthropy, what would it look like? So what kind of vision will you have about the new philanthropy that could be interesting to have. For example, if I ask the senatrice to look at the implication of the federal government or even all the government level, what kind of action, what kind of things could be done to have a philanthropy that will be more maybe effective, pertinent, and efficient? So I will ask first the senatrice and then open to the other member of the panel.
So let me speak about the law, because
Yeah.
the law, and that's what I do now as a legislator. The law is not abstract. It has real teeth. It has real impact. And the whole framework of charity and philanthropy law is completely outdated. It is grounded in Victorian norms of charity and philanthropy, very, very, old world constructs of generosity and, the idea of the wealthy being kind to the poor. And even though, we borrowed the language and the definitions from the United Kingdom, because our law is basically Elizabethan law, the United Kingdom has moved on, but we have not. We are still stuck in the 1950s. And this is partly because even though the charitable and philanthropic sector, gets a lot of the trust of Canadians, even though, the trust goes up and down based on the context of the day, it gets very little respect. It gets very little respect in the halls and corridors of the House of Commons and Senators. So as a first, we need to take a look at the law and see how that those constraints of outdated definitions, outdated requirements, outdated approaches actually make philanthropy more of a box for a privileged few. Because the philanthropic space is not open to everyone, as we well know. And I've set on a path to transforming that through the law. So one aspect of the law that needs to change desperately is the way charities are able to work with non-charities. And this is not an abstract conversation, because many of the organizations that work on the ground, working on issues of inequity, reconciliation, anti-racism, they are not charitable organizations, even though their work has a direct relationship to public benefit. So I'm seeking to change that, and I don't know how technical you want me to get, but that's one expression of the law that needs to change. The other expression is, frankly, the definition of charity. We do not have a definition of charity in this country. We have so-called heads of charities. Heads of charities are not definitions. Our sister jurisdictions in the United States, Australia, the UK, have all expanded their notions of what is charity. We still sort of tinker around at the edges. And then I would say the philanthropic space and the people who are in it are largely of a singular demographic. I have no real evidence to back me up, because evidence on inclusion in leadership and inclusion in governance is not available. And I worked with Stats Canada to get a picture, but that is not a picture in time, is not statistical evidence that I can go back year after year after year after year. And I can bet you, because I've lived in the philanthropic space, that even though some foundations are making, nice steps to be more open and inclusive in the governance, the fact is that the bylaws of many foundations prevent a certain kind of inclusion. Now, I'm also a legislator. Laws can get changed, and therefore bylaws can get changed. So my challenge to philanthropy is, philanthropy, heal yourself. It is much better for the sector to heal itself than to have the hammer of legislation come down on it. And I am devoted to both instruments. If one doesn't work, the other will.
Very interesting. So 3 elements, um, new way to work with non-qualified donors, very important. Of course, the law has to be changed. The definition, extensions of the what we understand by charity, and the philanthropic space, more democratic, more data, more transparent. How do you add or react to this vision? Well, I will maybe ask Chris. Like that, we'll go from government to the what we can call the communities.
Shem, thank you. Thank you so much for that, Senator Omadwar. I am always so appreciative of your commitment to the charitable sector and to the nonprofit sector in the work that you do, and learn always every time I get a chance to hear from you. I agree. This way in which the folks in the Canadian philanthropic sector conceive of and understand their work is very narrow, and I think could benefit from some creativity and imagination. And the one thing I would add is that the reimagining doesn't have to actually be something totally brand new. And I say that from the position of being an Indigenous person who knows that Indigenous practices, legal orders, and demonstrations of generosity continue to exist in this country today. And in fact, if they were more abundantly funded, supported, celebrated, and honored, then in fact, many more than just Indigenous communities would benefit. Broadly, the social fabric of this country would be strengthened. So I think to reconsider philanthropy in this country means asking very tough questions about what it means when the majority of financial assets sit in investments rather than sit in the homes and in the hands of organizations doing good work in their communities. That's something that needs to be grappled with. Are you a philanthropic sector, or are you an investment sector that dabbles in philanthropy? The other is very much that there's a desire sometimes for organizations or philanthropic organizations to think about how, well, I want to understand the organization. I want to understand the worldview of Indigenous communities so we can better serve them. The truth of the matter is, no one who's not Secwepemc, who is not from Secwepemc will ever have the opportunity to understand the depth of my knowledge and wisdom for redistributing the resources that come from my territory like I can. But what people can do is trust that if I know the abundant funding for the leadership of Indigenous peoples is the best thing to be doing, to acknowledge that knowing is not actually the right that you have, to know deeply Indigenous peoples' worldviews or practices. That, I think, extends to thinking about how to support other equity-seeking communities. Black communities, queer communities, disabled justice communities, they know best how to serve their own people. They know best what's needed, and they can do it in the most dignified, efficient, and caring manner. And so our call for philanthropy, thinking and doing differently, is actually to follow the lead. Stop doing focus groups and asking these equity-seeking organizations what you could do. Just follow their lead. Heed their advice and wisdom, and trust that their notion about what's needed not only serves their communities, but serves us all more broadly. So when I think about philanthropy in the future, I think we have a broader understanding that when we talk about settler philanthropy, we're talking about a very narrow, a very young practice. As Senator Omadwar said, it's only been around for, maybe 100 and so years. It's a very a young practice, and there are deep, long, intergenerational practices of true philanthropic giving in relation not only for the love of humanity, for demonstration of justice, but actually for the demonstration of all living things that exist and that can be learned from. So I look forward to a future when Indigenous philanthropic legal orders and practices are honored, abundantly funded and supported, but also that the leadership of equity-leading, equity-seeking organizations are also front and center. You asked a bit about what conditions would be necessary, which I know is a move into the next question. I would really love to see foundations get serious about what it means to sunset their asset base, what it means to sign a pledge for moving their assets to ethical investing and closing down shop. We are in a very particular moment in time for humans, and the imagination of 30 years sometimes even feels too long to wait. So I just wanted to share that as well. Thank you.
Migwash, thank you. Very interesting to recognize the knowledge, recognize the tradition, recognize that there's things that are belongs to the tradition that we have to look at, and not only try to go to the future and reimagine completely things. We have to ask very strong questions around investment. And of course, the question of sunsetting and the perennity of the philanthropic action. So that brings us to the two other panelists that belongs, or Jean-Marc before, because you're now retired from the Fondation Chagnon, but you were there for 20 years. So how do you perceive a kind of reimagination from your experience of the philanthropic world? And of course, the question that asked Senator and Chris about looking at the space, the philanthropic space from the inside. So maybe I'll start with Jean-Marc and then Sylvie.
Well, thank you, Jean-Marc. You're right. I totally agree with the senator on the fact that I think that the sector should take their own leadership to go in that direction. And the first thing maybe I would like to add, I'll agree with what had been said before. One thing I would add, the first thing is a stance. I think it's a conception of what's philanthropy. It induces a lot of practices and behaviors after, when we conceive ourselves as being as collective resources for collective utility. And it has impact on lots of practices or approach, like it just had been said, on the way we support and are the first followers of the ones who are on the field, either in place-based networks or different type of resources that we're supporting. And at a point where it reverses potentially completely the type of role and composition of the boards also, that or other bodies in those type of organizations that support that type of work. Then I think at a start, when we deepen the understanding of what it is to be a collective resource and for collective utility, it changes a lot of other conceptions we have about philanthropy. The other thing I would say also is then governance is certainly and governance and the way we use our powers and we govern ourselves are certainly in the mix there to be really deepen as a conversation in foundations. And the other part on investment, actually all resources of foundations should be aligned to mission. Then in either way, and including operating costs and including some principle of management of those operating costs should be aligned and answer through values that are behind those missions. Then it has to be a work it has to be deepened on those aspects also. And maybe last point on foundation, and we have also to reflect on the role of foundation. Actually, well, maybe we were forced in some ways in Quebec to have that conversation pretty sometimes harshly, but the relationship and the type of role of philanthropy to aside the state. I think philanthropy is in a very enviable position to play an increased role as an intermediary between private, public, civil society, between citizens, decision makers, practitioners, academics. But the state, and we believe the state, and at the end of the road, the big changes are around public policies. Then we have to really reflect on the type of additional contribution that foundations can bring in some, I would say, radical innovation, radical in the sense of the etymologic word, really looking at root causes, accept to be edgy in some ways, but to see how those eventual contribution can have an impact also with a lot of other stakeholders on public policy ultimately.
Thank you, Jean-Marc. So, of course, to have a reflection, inside reflection, to look at the definition and appropriation of the definition of philanthropy. That's interesting to talk about collective resource for collective communities. So to be able to really serve the community. And of course, the relation with the state is very, very important and in a complementary way. And as we need to have a better maybe perception of the frontiers, the boundaries between the action of the states and the action of the philanthropic sector. So Sylvie, on your side, how do you see the vision? What's your vision?
Much of what has already been said by the other panelists that really resonate with me. I'm not the first one to point out that the past couple of years, the crises that we've faced have really brought to light kind of the stark systemic failings that we're facing in our society as a whole. And these, in a way, reflect the failings of philanthropy so far, because we haven't really managed yet to bend the curve of justice and to address those root causes thus far. And I think it really demands, bold action. We need to be courageous at this time and actually step up and do things differently, because these, the climate crisis, inequality, systemic racism, these are kind of really intersecting and kind of mutually reinforcing existential threats. And we really need to move from talking to action. I think during this conference, there's lots of great ideas, inspiring examples, things that are happening. And I think people are a lot more receptive to new ideas, but now I think is the time to actually step up. And one of the very clear ideas to me is, I think has already been raised, is the idea that we need other voices at the table, right? And something that I've heard said before that again really resonates with me is the idea that if we're going to be trying to create a more just and equitable society, we can't have a conversation about how to do that without centering the voices of people who have experienced injustice and inequality, right? Because otherwise we're having the same conversations with the same people over and over again. We're going to have the same result. So how can we kind of flip that structure on its head and really do things in a different way? And I've been lucky, I mentioned before that I've been involved in different initiatives and have been able to learn alongside some really inspiring grassroots leaders and community organizers. And I just want to name a few of them because I'm going to try to share some of the ideas that they've passed along to me of Maïté Lebrex-Saganache, Ricardo Lamont, and Stephanie Germain, all of whom are really anchored in their communities, have been working for a long time for their different causes. And one of those key ideas, again, is the importance of transferring power and trust and decision-making. And that can be reflected in governance, in the way programs are done, in the way investments are done, really across the board. And if we really do that, we're going to be able to move away from just the traditional idea of charity, which is a very unequal kind of paradigm, and really move towards liberation, racial justice, solidarity, a more sustainable future. And those are really, I think, the kind of bold processes that we need to move towards. And if we do that, I think the solutions, the new way of doing will come forth quite naturally.
Thank you, Sylvie. Yeah, it's very important what you said, move from talking to action. There's many place where we have discussion and we we bring the same kind of ideas and we have part of solution and so on, but there's a kind of glass ceiling that we can pass through. And in the previous session we had a discussion about the the gatekeepers. There's a resource institution, people that are at key position in our society and that impeach transformation. So it's not possible, even if we are talking together, we agree on some solution, it's very difficult to pass through and to bring systematic change. So I would like you to react. What will you see as conditions or way to be able to rearrange, to make things happen? If I look at the federal government, it was very agile in the pandemic crisis. Money, there was no problem with money, it flows. And new way of doing things for grant making foundation, very flexible, very open, very trusty. And for 6 months, 8 months, there was a kind of new small reality. But suddenly it froze and we are stepping back to what we were doing previously. So what can we do to be able to sustain the waste of bringing change in our society? Because you do have idea, you identify very interesting key elements, but we need to push them to have a kind of consensus leadership to be able to change the gatekeepers of the institutions or the main organization to bring some new oxygen in society. So maybe I will go again with Madame la Sénatrice or Chris on the end. So I'll go with Chris and then after to the Sénatrice. Chris.
I have my hand up. I love this question. I'm ready for it. One of the things that could be done by folks in a position of power to advocate to federal government is to take a look at the T3010. And to understand how that could be used as a mechanism for data collection that is actually more useful for organizations such as myself as an Indigenous-led organization and other equity-seeking organizations. I'd like to understand kind of how and where we can do better as a sector to take a look at the diversity of boards. And Senator Omadvar and others were involved in helping understand the demographic makeup of boards in a survey, but I think that the federal government can do more to make it a requirement of charitable services. If there are organizations who purport to serve equity-seeking communities, how is it that they're demonstrating that the leadership and decision-making and authority is actually coming from those communities? So a revisioning of the T3010 would be excellent in terms of recognizing data gaps. Another is that there's all of this kind of noise in the air about an increase to the disbursement quota, and it would be an increase of 1.5%. And you know what I think? 1.5% is not much, but it's a start. And you know what would be an amazing way to have the philanthropic sector galvanize and demonstrate a move toward equity is to make a commitment that an organization who chooses to increase or is forced or mandated by government to increase their DQ by 1.5%, our invitation would be, why not make a commitment to ensure that that 1.5% of your annual giving goes directly to Indigenous-led organizations? We know broadly in this country, less than 0.5% of philanthropic dollars goes to Indigenous organizations. Wouldn't it be lovely if it was 1.5%? That's a very small way to start demonstrating value to Indigenous organizations. But I'll even go so far as to say it could be a way that organizations could demonstrate a commitment to other equity-seeking organizations. How many of your annual grant dollars go toward funding Black-led organizations, women-led, queer-led organizations? This is a very easy thing that could be done. If you don't know who those organizations are in your local community, we'd be happy to help you find them and connect you to other organizations who can do that. So an increase is not necessarily going to mean an actual value increase for equity-seeking organizations who are chronically underfunded today. However, a mandate that says it must be focused on climate, it must be focused on justice, it must be focused on equity-seeking organizations. I think that is one thing to consider. And then another condition is just recognizing that there needs to be a better quality education to Canadians. about the philanthropic sector and the way in which the majority of philanthropic dollars sit in investment vehicles. I think that if the broad average Canadian understood the disbursement quota, they would be shocked and alarmed. And I think that we need to, as has been indicated, if these are public dollars for the collective good, then the public needs to have an eyesight into what's actually happening. And unfortunately, organizations like mine and others who would like to be in a public conversation about this require the funding to do it. I don't think broadly the philanthropic sector is ready or interested to support groups like mine to make it a public conversation just yet. So those are a couple of specific actions I would recommend. Thank you.
Thank you. So I will go to Senatrice because there's 2 points, at least 2 points more that were addressed to the federal government or the law, the T3010 and the increase of the quota. I know that in the new budget there was an increase that was announced, but what Chris is talking about also is a kind of commitment toward the way that this money should be used as a charitable, in the charitable sector. So Senatrice?
Well, I do agree with Chris on all her points. I'm not just sure how possible it is to segment giving to certain sectors differently. Through the increase in the DQ. I recognize that the increase in the DQ will only result in more money, and more money in the sector is always good, but it will go to the same philanthropic space, which excludes Indigenous communities and Black communities and communities in the global South. And frankly, the law as it is currently constructed is an expression of neocolonialism and is experienced, especially in the global South, as a new form of white saviorism. I think the law has to change, and I'm gratified to read in the budget that the government is considering changes to the Income Tax Act in the spirit of the bill that I have proposed, but I need to see I need to see the language. I am not popping the champagne bottle quite yet because I want to see exactly what it will say. I do think that the discussion on the disbursement quota in the budget and in the philanthropic space has moved our attention from the real potential, which is not the disbursement quota, 3.5%, 5%, whatever it is. It is the $85 billion worth of assets. And we need now to shift our eyes to the assets. And as Jean-Marc has said, all resources of the foundation should be mission directed. And I'd like to see, and I'm prepared to do some work on this as my next effort in this field once the bill is hopefully law. I'd like to see some incentives or legislation that will require private foundations to invest their assets in mission-related products, whether they get an extra, whether they can count that towards their disbursement quota, that could be one idea, or there could be some special dispensation on other matters, that could be. But this is something, the next field, the next focus. I do want to take just a second of my time here to tip my hat to foundations that have been transformational. I think I've talked in such fora for a very long time, and I'm beginning to want to also defend the very good work that foundations have done, because I have lived in this space. I'll just give you a few examples of truly transformational work. The Walter and Duncan Gordon Foundation has graduated Indigenous students as lawyers. Now, these Indigenous lawyers are challenging the system. As another example, the McConnell Foundation has created it's technical, but it's transformative, a social finance marketplace with government so that private foundations, along with other wealthy people, can invest their money not in investment instruments, but in Indigenous housing, clean water, climate change initiatives, and get a reasonable return on their investment. The Atkinson Foundation is focusing on the rights of gig workers who are, I think we all know that the answer is not in improving the life of one person or two people, gratifying as that may be for the philanthropist, but the real answer is in changing the systems and the structures of work and of laws that govern employment. So I do want to tip my hat to those foundations, and I'm sure there are many more, because I do want us to remember that foundations can be the R&D of society when their investment and their grant making and their persona are dedicated to change, to justice. And it's about justice, and it's not about the donor. The light is shone on the work and not on buildings with names on them, although I'm sure buildings with names are also, essential at some point. I'll grant you that, but there's my bias on what needs to change.
It's a way to recognize the work that is done, but it's only one way, and maybe not the strongest one. So how do you react, Jean-Marc and Sylvie, to these ideas that goes in several directions? Of course, the law, the public policies, but also to look at the way that grant-making foundation can see their work and can have leadership in a transformative way. So maybe you could give some example from Francophone, because the sénatrices have given more elements that goes in the Anglophone world. So maybe we can do a kind of equilibrium of examples. Jean-Marc or Sylvie? Sylvie?
Can you hear me?
Oui.
Yes, okay. Just make sure I shouldn't have to refresh my page. I mean, I think those are excellent examples, and it's very encouraging, of course, to see the announcements in the recent budget. I appreciate Senator Omevar's reticence to wait to pop the champagne, but it's really where we, at least our foundation, look for a very positive eye about increasing the DQ and to see what it would look like to actually be able to support non-qualified donees. In terms of how I appreciate as well the point of view that philanthropy can be a role for good, and I really fundamentally believe in that as well. As long as philanthropy takes risks and does things that other actors cannot afford to do, possibly, and uses its power to share with others that ultimately are at the other end of the power spectrum, and if we kind of structure ourselves that way, then it can be, like you say, the R&D of kind of innovation and systems change and taking a look at the root causes of things. And that is the role that I see, at least for philanthropy. And like I was saying before, a way that I think is actually a condition that's essential to doing that is really centering the voices, the experiences, and the knowledge of people who are the furthest away from equity and justice, to think about what are those systemic solutions instead of just the one by one band-aid solutions to different problems, which might be indeed gratifying, but won't ultimately change things in the long run. And a tool to think about doing that I think is worth exploring is, again, switching on its head the idea of accountability. So often grantees are accountable to foundations, but really philanthropic leaders, the philanthropic sector, we need to be accountable to the most marginalized communities that we say that we're serving. What do they think of us, and what can we do better to actually show up, to leverage our power, to call for systems change when that needs to be done? Kind of like a good example to think about is the so-called guardian angels from the pandemic. So these are the people that took care of our elderly, of our children, of our homes, of our infrastructure, of the logistics of food distribution system, how to preserve the quality of life. Many of those with the most power and wealth that were on the other end of the spectrum with the least power and wealth and bearing the brunt of the impacts of the pandemic. So how can we center those experiences, that knowledge, to think about the solutions to the systemic problems that we're facing? How can we directly support them through these new tools, like other forms of not just charitable organizations, but directly supporting family, individuals, like leaders in their communities, grassroots movements? There's lots of ideas out there. And like I was saying, if we actually cede power and bring other voices to the table, I think the idea is about how to carry that through will come from those with the knowledge about how to bring it to pass.
Very interesting. There's also a tension in the philanthropic action. There's lots of ideas, lots of initiatives, but there's a kind of needs of the grant-making foundation to do work with organization. But even if they are able to do a little bit, then the very short term, they are not really on the long term. But organization in the field, they need support for a long time. So when foundations are confront with organizations that will need support for a long time, their reflex is to say, well, just we will shift the responsibility of financing those organizations to the state. But the state is not always there to be able to support. So how can we be very listening to the different needs in the community, but to be able to do it also in the long term? Are there tools, are there new way of thinking of action to be able to develop new ways of financing on the long-term initiative from the community? I see Jean-Marc saying yes, maybe
Well,
I can give, yeah.
yeah, well, there's, I don't know, we just before leaving the foundation, it was an idea that was playing around since close to 10 years, but recently, we're funding some organizations since 15, 18 years, 12 years. And, at one point, the funder has also to recognize that for some type of mission, some type of organization, you have to be there really for the long term. Then I think it's a decision to be taken and be acknowledged and to pursue. But the second thought after was around, are we obliged to stay in the dependency path around grants that always have an end after 3 years or 5 year period? Then recently we're piloting with a partner. You see, I still talk as a we. That I'm not really, I didn't leave yet, I guess, but the foundation just supported the idea of taking those grants and capitalize the initiative so it could support the operating costs of critical jobs in that initiative for the next 14 years, instead of being always in a grant process. Then, I think, and actually the foundation is also supporting a study to see what would be the other ways of supporting on the long-term basis, using the money differently than by grants. But that's just an idea. I'm sure there's lots of others in the field, and I'm glad that the senator lift up the fact that there's a lot of foundation already working in that direction. And maybe if I had something to add, I think it's in a lot of those aspects. I think we have to be happy that the discussion around the DQ open up the dialogue, and we have to find a way to continue that dialogue. But I think also that there's place for more collaboration between foundation, especially probably around the asset management part, as learning from different practices and expertise from others, but also pulling up our capacity to also influence practices in the investment field. And I think there's already things going on, and I know that the Fondation Trottier is part of CREOS and other networks like this that are working in that direction. Then I think we have to find ways to pool our expertise and resources to do more and better around those aspects.
Great, thanks, Jean-Marc. I think that Senatrice would like to add something. Yeah.
I think this is a really important question, and a question that needs to have some discipline devoted to it, and research and analysis and best practices. I will say that there is an abiding tension in private foundations, a tension between, are you the risk capital of society or are you the patient capital of society? And there's a sea of difference between the two approaches. And I don't have an answer to that, except to say, that foundations, too often, especially the small mom and pop foundations, seem to be particularly seduced by flirting and flitting from cause to cause to cause. And I think smaller foundations need to be supported. In the study that the Senate did about the charitable sector, and this will interest most people, we looked at the sources of revenue in the sector, in the charitable sector, and there are only 3 sources, and 2 are declining. Government grants, if you take COVID out of the equation, government grants are declining. Private foundation grants are declining. Now let's see if the DQ has an impact. I mean, my analysis and information tells me that the increase in DQ will result in between $300 to $400 million of added disbursements going principally to a core group of institutions. The only source of revenue that is growing is earned revenue. That is the only source of revenue that is growing. And again, on the earned revenue side, there are significant legal constraints that need to be addressed, because technically at this point, charities are not able to generate earned revenue through unrelated causes. So a hospital can operate a gift shop, and a museum can do the same, but the YMCA cannot turn itself into a development body, which likely with all the real estate they have or had. So these are interest. That's a very important question, and I welcome Jean-Marc's information that some studies and some analysis is being done, because what we need is a way out of this, and we don't have it yet.
Sylvie, would you like to add something about the?
I mean, certainly having kind of long-term commitment to sorry about that. To organizations and communities that we're serving is absolutely essential. So I wholeheartedly agree with that point of view, and it's concerning, the data that the senator was alluding to, that the sources of funding for the charitable sector are decreasing, except for the revenue generating portion. Another systemic part of it is something that maybe I'll speak to a bit later as well, is the other area that I'm personally interested in, which is tax justice. So if we have a fairer tax system, it also gets to the very heart of the issue as well, about the government having sufficient resources at its disposal to actually serve our society, our country, our province, whichever level of government body we're talking about. And that ultimately, I think, would go to creating, a more just society, again, with the idea that when everyone is doing well, everyone is benefiting. So that's kind of, to me, has to be part of the discussion.
Yeah, the question of the tax justice is very important. Like the senator said, the capacity of the states to support the community organization seems to be decreasing, as you said, but the wealth is not decreasing in society; it's increasing. So there's a big stake about the fiscality and how we can have a better collective redistribution of wealth. Do you have example of countries where there are better ways of managing the fiscal activities?
So I sorry, I'm going to jump in here because I get all
no problem.
Itchy about this question. I don't think I have examples from other countries, but I think we share problems with other countries. Canada and other countries must stop issuing charitable receipts for the setup of donor advice funds and transfer the distribution of them into sometime into the future. Donor advice funds are the fastest growing philanthropic instrument at this point. And the way they are governed, like they are governed in the United States, a fund holder can set up a donor advised fund, get 100% of the charitable tax exemption for the value of their investment, and then they can sit and think and think a little more.
And do nothing.
Okay. Yeah. And I'm not saying this is true for all donor advised funds, and I'm not saying that it's not important to think. Most of these donor advised funds have been set up by people who've, made huge amounts of money through technology or something, and they actually need to think about exactly how they're going to invest. But not having a rule around disbursement in time is a fix that we must consider. And the United States is thinking about it. Canada is thinking about it. The Senate Charities report made a recommendation to the government, but I guess we can only rely on the government to pick off one point at a time. This year it was the DQ. Maybe next year it will be donor advised funds.
But I think we also have to be careful about DAF, because community foundation, I think they are mobilizing donor advised funds, but do you see them as the same kind of problem as the one that you mentioned? No? Okay.
Community foundations that have a whole bunch of funds are really doing great work. But here's the problem, and it's not particular to community foundations, it's also to wealth managers, etc. As long as an aggregate of funds under your management disperses to the amount of 3.5%, that is okay. But the individual fund is not obliged to disperse. And I think we need to get down to the individual funds as opposed to the aggregate collection of community funds. I want to tip my hat to the Vancouver Community Foundation, which has made a policy that all donor advised funds will disperse to a minimum rate on an annual basis. So again, there are things that the government does not need to legislate. The sector can lead the way.
That's very important. The role also of the sector to be auto-regulating his own actions and behavior. I see a kind of strange mood on Chris' face. So you want to react?
Yeah, I do think it's a recognition that, of course, the sector itself has to take responsibility for where they can change practice and policy. However, I don't think that the sector itself should be auto-regulating. I do think that more of the public audience needs to understand it and be engaged in learning more and adding and applying pressure to create some change. I think part of how we end up in the situation we're in is because the philanthropic sector holds a lot of weight and a lot of advocacy power, and has auto-regulated itself for maybe a little bit too long. And, without the likes of folks like Senator Omadvar and the steering committee on the advisory for the social sector, I think that there would be very little conversations. There would be, backroom conversations. This wouldn't be a public conversation. So I just want to respond as well to the last question. Some very pragmatic and very easy things that people could start taking a look at and doing. One is, if you're not aware of the climate pledge work that has been highlighted and amplified in the Canadian context, which has with it an implementation guide and an accountability metric. If folks care about climate justice and you're in philanthropy, I'd recommend that you learn more about that. Additionally, if you have the ability and power to be thinking about funding capital, please do that. Capital costs money, and organization stability can benefit from being able to own their buildings, to own the land in which they provide their services. This is about wealth generation over time and should be done more and more often. It goes without saying, but I'll say it again, multi-year general operating dollars. And, I dream about being in relationships to my own funders in 3 to 5 year relationships for my God dollars. I can't even imagine a 10 or 12 or 15-year investment, but I'm open to having it. And I think many, many organizations would love to be in those conversations. What could our work do? What could we be if we actually could dream into the future for that length of time? How much more impact could we have if we knew that we could invest in our staff, in our buildings, in the infrastructure of our work? I would also suggest that there has to be an increased investment in the systemic infrastructure to support organizations like some of our members, Indigenous organizations, Indigenous-led grassroots movements, organizations who require the infrastructure of HR and finance and legal support, who for all kinds of reasons choose not to be registered charities and in part would be denied charitable status because of their advocacy work. The funding the infrastructure broadly is an important investment in learning more about the sector, but supporting it. And then just the last thing, the very last thing, I would love to see organizations and funders funding organizations' investment in providing RSPs, top-notch health and wellness and dental vision benefits to staff, and investing in pension programs for staff in the nonprofit sector. That is something that would be easy to do. We'd love to see that happen. And if folks want to have a conversation, we'd like to be part of that. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, for those solutions. So how do you react, Jean-Marc or Sylvie, to those way to move towards to be able to advance in a kind of new vision or new way or new behavior for the philanthropic sector? So
I'm comfortable. I'm comfortable, but I would.
Great.
And today I have no responsibility about being comfortable, but I would maybe we had for some of the things that you brought up, Chris. We had the conversation with some of our key networks, nonprofit networks, organization over here. Actually, lots of them. And interestingly, for your last point on dental and medical and all social advantages, benefits in organization. Interestingly, we were with others going forward in that direction, and they told us, no, help us advocate that to our state, to the Quebec government. Then again, I come back to the relationship with what foundation can do and what philanthropy can do, government should do. And actually, it opened up a new conversation with them to see how we could manage and push this. And actually, it's progressing in the right directions. Then I think there's always that type of arbitrage to be done also in some of those areas. And an idea that came up also listening to the conversation is for foundation also. I think there's a place also to reflect on what is the notion of attributable effects, that what type of expectations do we have as an organization? What type of, others will say, results or impacts are we expecting? I think that's a conversation also that sometimes leads not necessarily in the right or coherently with the rest of the conversation we had. And I think there's a place also there to have reflection on what is the notion of what we're working for at the end of the road. At the Chagnon Foundation, just to give an example, we've finally decided to focus more on, are we relevant? And that means, of course, being really in a deep relationship in the social fabric in Quebec to be seen as being relevant in what we're doing. Are we really in a relationship, a constructive one? And are we helping building power and capacity muscle of those organizations so that they can achieve their goals? And are we helpful to build a movement for change? And that's the focus. Of course, all this is done towards a mission of social justice around youth development, but the focus of our attributable effects are these ones. And actually, I think there's a tension. There's always a tension there. Like there's another tension between being reactive, I would say, supportive, first follower, Some would say, my good colleague over here in the call, Jean-Marc Fontan, would say probably self-effacing. In French, it would be effacement. And an approach that is also proactive, entrepreneurial, or assertive enough, but not dominating. There's also a tension there that has to be discussed and try to find conciliation around those type of tension that have effects on the rest of what we've talked a bit earlier.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. Sylvie?
Yeah, I mean, so many of the ideas I think have been raised already are really worth exploring and moving forward with. The way I try to think about it, maybe it's an overly simplistic plan, but about is sort of threefold. So the first is the way that we do our philanthropic giving. So there's the very tangible element of how much money goes out the door. So with the DQ, that's increasing. That's great. I hear Chris's idea about how many foundations are willing to step up and have a sunsetting approach. That needs to be a conversation that I think more foundations need to have, especially we've seen the returns on endowments being very high in the past few years. Meanwhile, we're facing crises like never before. So how can we square that circle? That's something that's important. But just the money out the door in and of itself is not enough. It's also where is it going? And again, I reiterate, it's Earth Day today, the climate crisis, existential threat. It has really a disproportionately small amount of philanthropic dollars going there. That's something our foundation tries to advocate for, about how can we really catalyze change, something that I think more foundations should be doing. And also the way that we fund, right? And I think it's funny the way Jean-Marc was saying that he's comfortable, but I think philanthropy should sometimes be uncomfortable and push ourselves to those places about how we do things. And, the Black and Indigenous communities are often very uncomfortable. How can we again flip that around and for philanthropy to be uncomfortable about the questions that they ask us about how we can do better, how we can show up in real relationship in the way that we do things. So that sort of closes my parentheses on the giving. The other really important thing that's been noted multiple times is what do we do with that now other 95%, the investments, that really has to be aligned with the values, that's with the money that's going out the door. So how can we align it with a climate lens, also with a gender and an equity lens as well. More can be done to also, as a sector, come together. An example, our foundation, we're working with others on something called an ESG championship. That's just one example of trying to see just investment managers who's actually walking the talk and how can we find the best of the best and then put our money there. That's like a kind of a practical example. And my final pitch is what I mentioned before about great, give more money, the money that foundations have, invested wisely, but also why do certain foundations have so much and continue to have more and more? Let's talk about tax justice as well. So that I think is essential to the conversation.
And thank you very much, Sylvie. I just look at the chat. We don't have any questions or comments. We had more than 60 people in the audience. I don't know if, Peter, you had something on your English chat. Are there questions or comments?
Yes, I've got a few questions here. One is from Florine, who would like to know whether it's possible to expand on the concepts mentioned about capitalizing a grant for long-term support. They're not quite sure how this could work.
Yeah, well, essentially, if I can do a short story, we're granting, let's say for this initiative, if I recall properly, for the last 5 years, it was something like, for the entire initiative, it was something like close to 6-7 million. But after 5 years, it's over. And after the promoters of those initiatives have to come back. And the key part in the initiative, there's of course the different type of action, but there's also the motor, the key jobs and the key competencies, the key profiles that they wish to, like I think Chris or others talked about a bit earlier, try to see on a long-term basis instead of looking at a very short-term basis. Then what we're trying now is coupling two things. The first thing is a grant of a grant. Actually, it's money to be capitalized in the community foundation in that area of Quebec. It's a $7 million capitalization. Then it's a sort of a grant for capitalization, and it's given to that initiative through the Fondation Communautaire, and that money will be managed over there to keep those jobs, those key critical competencies and profile, especially in the actual labor market in Quebec, there for 12 to 14 years. And there's another grant for the more evaluative actions that are made by the initiative that follows through after. And of course, the area, well, it's a region. They expect also to probably try to find monies that would come also from government and private sector also to complement either one of those two funds. Hopefully, it answers. Yeah.
Merci, Jean-Marc. So Peter, was there another question?
There was a comment, and maybe the senator will speak to this too, or someone else, and that is whether there's a particular role in this conversation that community foundations can play, because there are distinct features and related to community foundations that you could say sort of have a dual role. They both raise funds and distribute funds in some ways, and they are also, as has been mentioned, a serious player in the donor advice fund arena. But we have been talking a lot around the particular role of private foundations, and so one of the comments related to is there a particular role that people think that community foundations could play?
I thank you for that question. Community foundations are a significant part of the philanthropic landscape, but they are a different kind of institution. But I think their power in transformation is amplified because of their direct links to the community. A private foundation can stay isolated within its board and with its staff and grantees. A community foundation is of the community, it's grounded in the community, it's rooted in the community. So it's direct relationship, and we've talked at some point in this conversation about how important relationships are. It has, I think, a greater responsibility in a way to ensure that those relationships are nurtured and that those voices are around the table. I certainly know that the city where I live, Toronto, the Community Foundation has transformed itself with great effect to be a holder of funds that serves the community as opposed to a holder of funds that serves the owner of the funds. I mean, this is not easy to do. But they have worked at it over the last 20 years, as have other foundations. I'm not sure about smaller community foundations. I actually think they have greater potential because of their reach into the community in more immediate ways than large foundations. And I also want to point out that community foundations have been very vocal on issues of justice and philanthropy, around legislative change, around the DQ, about the rebalancing of power, about privilege. They have stood side by side with me and others in this field to advance the cause. So I think they're incredibly important players, and I thank the individual for that question.
Chris?
Thank you very much, Chris. Yeah.
I wanted to add to that piece around community foundations. They are a key player, and I think that they can be doing better. I think that community foundations are seen more and more as a progressive voice in the philanthropic sector, and yet Let's talk about the leadership of community foundations across this country. Let's talk about the executive leadership. Let's talk about the board makeup and the demographic or the lack of diversity, both in terms of leadership, board makeup, and executive leadership. If we have agreed here, which I think we heard, that the voices of those who are impacted and furthest away from justice should be involved, community foundations have a long way to go to demonstrate that kind of a diverse representation. It's not enough to have diversity around some of the grant decision-making tables if the grant decision-making is only 3.5 or maybe 5% of your giving, and you have an investment committee that's sitting on a different pot of money, and that's an all white or predominantly male space. We have to be willing to have a conversation about how that's something to be changed. Additionally, I think community foundations could play a much stronger role in building bridges to the local nations where they operate. If a community foundation is about place, then I think that they can do a heck of a lot more to be in relationship to the actual nations whose land that they do their work on. Additionally, if you want to build community, I think you need to be willing to recognize that it requires a conversation about the origin of wealth. Many of the oldest community foundations in this country, their wealth, if you look all the way back to the beginning, has a very clear and a distinct connection to the wealth generated from stolen land and from resources off of the land of Indigenous peoples. Let's have a conversation about reparations. Let's have a conversation about how if an organization has funds to give, that they should be giving in perpetuity an amount of money to the local nations where they live, work, and play. Those are some bold actions that I think community foundations should be considering and taking action in. And then just last, I do want to say there are a range of community foundations who are volunteer-led. These are small shops in small rural communities. These are folks who are, working very hard to increase philanthropic behavior and giving in their local communities. And I want to really give thanks to folks who are doing that work, but also to continue to press upon the larger foundations, the leadership that they can have to do more, to be better. I have higher expectations for them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. So I think we are at the end of the work on the of the panel. It was really, really interesting. So thank you very much, Madame la Sénatrice Ratna Omivar, Chris Archie, Jean-Marc Chouinard, et Sylvie Trottier. But thank you very much for them. We had also many artists that made very interesting and important contribution to the work we did. And of course, a laugh is important in our life. The coordinator, the hub's coordinator, worked hard to develop different sessions for the conference. So thank you very much to Adam, Adriana, David Grant, Émilie Dawes, François Brouard, Irina Krovenkov, Isidora Sidorovska, Kelly Wooden, Lynn Dulcik, Manuel L'Italien. The work was very, very, very important. And of course, Chris Archie and Heather who watch for the Indigenous Circle work with the research on the Indigenous questions. Merci important, a very important thanks to the translator, Mercedes Amoretti, Michel Jetchik and Stephen Jetchik, sorry for the pronunciation. We do have a lot of partners that support the work that we do at the Philab, so thank you very much for you from the philanthropic sector and also from the federal government with the SHIRC. Of course, there's a key people that were at the heart of the organization of the conference. So thank you very much to Annick Boivin, professional consultant, Benoît Martel, Diane Alalouf-Hall, of course me, Jean-Marc Fontan, but Catherine McDonald, that was a very, very important key person in the organization, and Peter Elson. Of course, we did it on a virtual scene with new technology, so we thanks all the people from Kubidex and Humanize to have made that possible, and learn how to work on a virtual fashion. So those are the acknowledgement I would like to do before the end. Like we said, it's an opening, ending, but also an opening. And the opening, like was said, is to pass from talking to action. So the next conference we want to do will be more precisely direct to action. And it will be an international conference. And we think that it will be in 2024, so in 2 years from now. So thank you very much and have a good weekend.
Thank you.